As the Great Crusade progressed, the Emperor was at last reunited with many of his lost sons, the Primarchs. After swearing fealty to their father, each of these demigods of war was placed in command of the Space Marine Legion created from his DNA. In every case, the rediscovery of a Primarch wrought great changes in his legion, almost always for the better. But one of the Legiones Astartes, the 15th Legion, found itself on the brink of extinction only a few decades after its founding. For this legion, for the Emperor's 1,000 sons, the only chance of salvation lay in the rediscovery of its Primarch, the complicated man known to history as Magnus the Red. When the Emperor had created the Space Marine Legions on Terra, the 15th Legion was raised differently from all the rest. Their numbers were purposely chosen from those Terran populations largely free of unpredictable mutation and from the most loyal and culturally advanced of the techno-barbarian states. Many of the recruits were selected by the Emperor himself, an honor that had been shown to no other legion. Exactly 1,000 new Astartes ultimately swore their oaths of eternity to the Emperor. When they were done, he bade his 1,000 sons to rise and serve mankind, and they were known by that name ever after. The 1,000 sons chose the ancient M-shaped millennial glyph to represent their legion, which commemorated the Emperor's choice of their name. Their power armor was colored in part with the yellow that had once graced the robes of the elite immortal regiments of Old Earth's ancient Persian Empire. It was from that region of the planet that so many of the 15th Legion's recruits had been drawn. The 1,000 Sons soon proved as competent as any of the Legiones Astartes in operation, and possessed a degree of synchronization during combat that was beyond that seen in the other legions. However, for all the care taken in their creation, there was little that made them stand out during the early campaigns of the Great Crusade. Yet as the years passed, many members of the 15th Legion began to develop extremely potent psychic powers at an unusually high rate. This was not seen as desirable by the other legions. Their Astartes had come during the Unification Wars to see psykers only as abominations that should be destroyed and never trusted. But the 15th Legion had been created by the Emperor for a special purpose. Like the Departamento Investigates, the 1,000 Sons would serve as psychic weapons against others of their kind. Just as the Investigates' Primaris psykers fought warp-possessed renegades on Imperial worlds, so too were the 1,000 Sons intended to defeat psychic military threats on the frontier. They had been created to fight fire with fire when no other alternative existed for the Great Crusade. Unlike the demon-possessed witches of Old Night, 1,000 Sons gifted with psychic abilities were individuals of strong will in complete control of their powers. They could unleash living fire, streams of lightning, and blasts of armor-cracking telekinetic force. In their presence, mortal wounds would heal in seconds, and they could foresee routes to victory when defeat seemed all but certain. Despite the other legions' misgivings, the 1,000 Sons were led by the Emperor personally on a number of critical missions where their talents were put to good use. But for all their strength, the 1,000 Sons were ultimately defined as a legion by what happened during a single campaign on the world of Bezant. Elements of the 15th Legion had been tasked with bringing the sun-worshipping humans of Bezant into imperial compliance. The Byzantine people had proven unwilling to give up their golden temples and the commands of their superstitious priests to embrace the reason of the imperial truth. The Byzantine priests were all chosen from those who could hear the light of the stars. They were psykers. They met the 1,000 Sons not with swords and firearms, but with mind-conjured flame, nightmarish illusions, and the ability to disintegrate matter itself. The Legion fought back using their own powers. That day on Bezant, the fundamental elements of existence itself seemed to go to war. Yet the 1,000 Sons had never been so tested by any foe. They were unable to overcome the Byzantine priests at first, and the result was a psychic deadlock. The psykers of both sides strained against each other so hard that they forced black rain to fall from the sky. The terrible psychic pressure suddenly ruptured as a single word echoed like a scream through every mind on the planet. This shriek of Deleth was the name of a 1,000 Sons warrior who was suddenly consumed by the rebellion of his own body. The substance of the Space Marine's form literally unraveled. Wax-like flesh spilled from rents in his armor as his bones fused with his war gear. His blood turned to mist and congealed into grotesque new forms in midair. In an act of mercy, his brothers slew him, unleashing bolter fire and cleansing flame until nothing but dust remained. But the true horror had only begun for the 15th Legion. The Thousand Sons eventually won the campaign on Bezant. For a time they seemed unchanged. They told themselves that what had happened to Deleth was simply a fluke caused by the extraordinary amounts of warp energy unleashed. But in the wake of the battle, the Astartes of the 15th Legion continued to develop ever greater levels of psychic power. Then another Space Marine unexpectedly fell prey to the same affliction, and then a third, their bodies dissolving into warp energy, mutating uncontrollably. These losses soon became an epidemic. Hundreds of thousand sons could be affected at once. There was no cure, and the Legion, never numerous to start, began to dwindle away. There were no indications of demonic possession, nor could the Legion apothecaries find any commonality between the affected beyond bearing the Thousand Sons gene seed. There was also little sympathy from the other Astartes legions. They already viewed the 15th Legion's reliance on psychic abilities as sorcery, once more using an archaic term for the worst psychic abuses of the Age of Strife. The Thousand Sons came to call their affliction the Flesh Change. In desperation, they began to place their brothers in stasis chambers on their Legion starships and outposts at the first signs of the change. No solution seemed at hand, and many in the Imperium began to call for the cursed 15th Legion to be disbanded. The Emperor knew that previous gene seed lines that had suffered degradation had been stabilized by taking fresh samples from the Legion's genetic source. This meant that only reuniting the Legion with its Primarch offered any hope of salvation. Luckily for the Thousand Sons, the Emperor knew exactly where to find him, for they had been in telepathic contact through the warp for decades. The Primarch of the Thousand Sons called the world of Prospero home. It was a polished jewel of human space, a world of peace and stability. Prospero shone brightly through the darkness that had consumed the galaxy during Old Night. But this ascendancy was not only the result of advanced technology, but of a culture dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms. However, this culture had been born of the necessities of survival in the face of an ancient disaster. At the dawn of the Age of Strife, like so many other human worlds, Prospero had seen a sudden explosion in the number of psykers. But instead of unleashing the horrors of demonic possession, this psychic population had proven fertile ground for infestation by the warp creatures known as psychneuein. The psychneuein were nightmarish psychic parasites similar in form to giant wasps over 2 meters long, who could live within both the warp and real space. Drawn to individuals in the mortal realm with psychic ability, the warp parasite's reproductive cycle required that their eggs be gestated within the mind of a psyker in real space. This was exactly what happened to the people of Prospero. In a single night, newborn psychneuein suddenly erupted from infected psykers after devouring them from within. Facing attacks from swarms of the creatures suddenly birthed into reality, Prospero's advanced civilization collapsed within days. Those few who survived the fall recovered what understanding and high technology remained to them and founded a new settlement. Defined by its glittering crystal pyramids, Tizca, the City of Light, the Citadel of Reason, became the last and only true city on Prospero amidst the wastelands known as the Desolation. Over time, Tizca's people learned to control and enhance their psychic potential through intense practices of meditation and mental control. This provided them with the necessary willpower to ensure that they never again became hosts for parasites or the demonic predators of the warp. On Prospero, psykers not only flourished, they came to rule. The Primarch named Magnus came to Prospero like a comet. His gestation capsule descended as a slash of fire to slam into the marbled heart of Tizca. As the city shook, the minds of every person within were overwhelmed by a psychic burst of light and sensation. The infant Magnus was ultimately found and raised by Amun, Tizca's foremost scholar and the greatest psyker on Prospero. As Amun interacted with the Primarch, he realized that Magnus had the potential to be one of the most powerful psykers who had ever lived. But he also sought to instill caution and patience, to temper genius with humility. Even so, in only a few short years, the pupil became the master. Magnus soon achieved heights of brilliance and psychic ability greater than any Prospero had ever known. At maturity, Magnus was a striking figure. One of the largest of the Primarchs, he was over twice the height of a normal man, and possessed deep red skin. On a world ruled by psykers, it was not long before Magnus was chosen as their leader. Called the Crimson King and Magnus the Red, the Primarch helped Tizca flower like never before, pushing it to achieve unparalleled heights of intellectual and psychic mastery. Under Amon's tutelage, Magnus had learned to extend his mind outwards into the Imperium. It was during these sessions that he first met the Emperor, and the two began to have regular telepathic conversations across the great distances between them. The Emperor taught his most psychically gifted son the nature of the warp and of the terrible threats to humanity that lurked within. He also explained that he desperately needed his lost son's help. When the Emperor finally arrived at Prospero, he came at the head of the 15th Legion's fleet, where the number of thousand suns in stasis now outnumbered those still awake. The flesh change had begun anew, even as the fleet made orbit, and Magnus vowed to find a cure for his gene son's affliction. He sealed himself away from all contact and delved into every scrap of lore and knowledge the vast libraries of Tizca held about the warp. None know exactly what transpired or what Magnus studied in his sanctum. When he finally emerged, he had lost one of his eyes and would give no explanation for its loss. But he had found the answer, and when it was implemented, the flesh change was no more. The price proved high, for only 1,000 Astartes of the Legion survived the cure. To fill out the 15th Legion's numbers, Magnus began to recruit new members from the people of Prospero. In truth, Magnus did not just save his legion, he utterly reshaped it. Their armor's livery was altered to match the crimson of their Primarch's skin, while their badge was changed to a Prosperine solar glyph. Far from denying the Thousand Sons the use of their psychic powers, Magnus enhanced and refined their use, training his genetic sons in the arts he had mastered on Prospero. The 15th Legion was reorganized around the 5 cults used by Prospero's psykers. Each was centered on a different psychic specialty, like foreseeing the future or telepathic communication. In his new recruits, Magnus sought both psychic potential and intellectual excellence. His Space Marines would not be mere killers bred to slaughter, but the bringers of civilization to the darkest corners of the galaxy. It was to this end that Magnus and his 1,000 sons joined the Great Crusade. The Crimson King believed that the purpose of the Crusade was not simply to conquer the galaxy, but to redirect mankind onto a new and better path. He hoped to establish a new golden age of spiritual and intellectual enlightenment, even if that gift needed to be earned by the terrible necessity of war. As a result, wherever the 1,000 Sons went during the Crusade, they sought to recover lost knowledge to aid this goal. This was also why Magnus strongly promoted what was known as the Librarius Project. This initiative would create a corps of so-called librarians in the Legiones Astartes. Each of these Space Marines were psykers, trained on Prospero in the disciplines Magnus pioneered to enhance the prowess of every legion. However, many of the other Primarchs, even those who eventually allowed a Librarius in their legions, remembered the flesh change. The memory of that affliction left them skeptical at best of anything having to do with the warp in general, and the 1,000 Sons in particular. But the Emperor approved of the idea, and a Librarius division was soon established in almost all of the legions. For a time, it seemed that Magnus and his 1,000 Sons had finally found a measure of acceptance. But far across the galaxy, another of the Emperor's lost sons was afflicted with visions of glory. He had long preached to his people that salvation would arrive in the form of a golden god and his one-eyed angel. That prophecy was about to be fulfilled at last.